Okay, so before we get into our character, I want to go through the process of what skin binding is and give you some examples of some of the different settings so you are aware of it. So let's go ahead and get started by just creating a cylinder here. I'm going to go ahead and hit T on the cylinder and just give it 3 divisions down the center, or maybe we'll give it, let's give it like 6, and then we'll just go ahead and make it a little bit taller, and we can go ahead and snap the pivot here, snap to the base, and then we'll just add in a couple joints to make this thing bend. So let's come in here to our skeleton. We'll go ahead and create a joint. Go ahead and just place one. Turn on your shading X-ray joints if you haven't yet in the view you're working in, and we'll just hit X. I'm going to turn on shading here, Control D and V, Control D and V, and that should give us an okay amount of joints to make this function. I might just move that up 1 and move this up 1 to be more in the middle. So that way it has some bend points. And then we'll just take the top here, we'll come to the base and hit P, come to the base here and hit P, and that will give us a nice base area to start with in terms of skinning and to talk about weight painting. Now I'm going to duplicate this off to the side to talk about some different bind methods to begin with, so we can kind of go through that together. And I'll just make several of these, and then one more that I'm not going to use, but we're going to come back to. So the process of hooking up a skeleton to a geometry piece to form what we call skin is pretty simple. You select the geometry, you shift select the joint here, and then you come up here to skin and you just click bind skin, and this will be bound. Now that is how you do it. The only problem is you don't know what settings are set, and we're going to talk about that. If I go and turn on X-ray joints now, you'll see when I bend this, the joint now controls the geometry. Now, how that's controlling it doesn't matter too much because we can always go back in and change that, but you'll see that each of these joints has some influence over our geometry. If you want to go back to the bind pose, you can select the object, go to skin, and you can select to return to bind pose. So inside of here, you'll see go to bind pose as an option. There we go. If you want to unskin, you can select the geometry and come in here to skin and unbind, and that will get rid of the skinning, and now the joints will no longer affect it. Now, when creating skin, there's a few settings we need to get into in terms of binding, and I want to show you them here so you understand why we use them. Let's start by selecting the geometry, selecting the base joint, going to skin, and into bind skin. There's a lot going on here, so let's go ahead and give you the rundown. The first thing is what to bind to. You'll see you have joint hierarchy, selected joints, or object hierarchy. I mentioned previously you could use objects as bones. That's how you would do it here. Now, they do that for some large film productions. For example, when they're doing things like humans or creatures, they'll actually have a skeleton inside of it where they will use that. In some cases, they also use things like muscle simulations. That's really advanced stuff, so stuff you could look into if rigging fascinates you. Selected joints is just the individual joints you have selected, and this can be very useful when you only want a single joint or a certain number of joints to affect the geometry. So for example, we could have selected all the joints except for our helper joints for the IK, and we could have bound it to that, but it's just kind of easier to get rid of them in our case. The final one is joint hierarchy, and that means all of the joints in the hierarchy. That means you just select the top of the hierarchy, and you just select the geometry, and it's going to bind the rest. So that's going to be what we want there. Now, the bind method doesn't really matter. This is going to be how the object moves initially in terms of influence proximity. So what does that mean? That means what joint controls what vertices. Ultimately, we're going to use weight painting to drive this, so none of these really matter. Closest distance, closest in hierarchy, heat map, geodesic voxel, they're all different methods of accomplishing the same thing. Geodesic voxel tends to be the best one. It is the newest one to Maya, so I generally start there. But if I'm going to be honest, I always erase what I'm doing and start from scratch with very few exceptions. So almost every rig I build, I manually recreate the weight. But that's going to be what the bind method is there. Now, the next method actually does matter, and this is the skidding method. You'll see we have classic linear, dual quaternion, and weight blended. Dual quaternion is usually the one that works best for me. We're going to talk about what each of these does, but the main gist of these is they handle volume differently. So what do I mean by that? As an object bends, twists, turns, the volume gets displaced, and each of these handles it in a different way, and each of them have a valid reason for existing. Moving down in terms of the weight distribution, I don't really play around with this one too much. I just leave it at the default of distance, but you can see you can swap between those. Once again, because we go through the process of manual weight painting, that doesn't matter. Allow multiple bind poses means that it can have more than one bind pose if you need to bind multiple skins. Max number of influence is going to be the max number of influences that can affect this. You can see that we can maintain, we can remove unused, we can colorize skeleton. All these are nice little toggles. When you colorize it, you'll notice the skeleton changes from the default to being rainbow. Resolution is going to deal with geodesic voxel. So pretty much all of these we don't need to worry about. And you'll actually notice that some of these change based on which bind method you're using. Okay, so as far as we care, really the only thing we're going to play around with is going to be the skinning method, bind to joint hierarchy, and that's really all we need to worry about at this stage. Now let's go ahead and talk about this and start out with our bind of classic linear. I'm going to select the base joint, shift select the geometry, and hit apply here. So this is going to be done with classic linear. Then I'm going to come to this next one, select the joint, shift select the geometry, and we're going to swap this to dual quaternion and hit apply. And then we're going to come to the last one here, select the base joint, shift select the geometry, and we're going to do weight blended and hit apply. Now, if I go ahead and take this middle rotation and we rotate these forward, they all should rotate similarly, but differently at the same time. So if I were to come to a side view here, you'll see how those volumes are maintaining differently. And notice that this front one here I did with classic linear is losing its volume compared to the middle one. Likewise, if I switch to the other side, you'll see the outside one here is also losing volume compared to the middle one. So the middle one was the fancy one here called dual quaternion, and the outside ones are the classic linear and weight blended. So classic linear and weight blended tend to maintain volume poorly. Dual quaternion is what we want to use when we are creating characters. Now, when it comes to classic linear and dual quaternion, as well as the weight blended, if I select hierarchy here and we rotate down Y, you'll notice a big difference between these. So this is classic linear, this one out here is weight blended, but this one's dual quaternion, and that's twisting down the center. Notice how dual quaternion maintains its volume, whereas classic linear and the other one, which is weight blended, do not. That makes classic linear and weight blended good for something like maybe a candy wrapper, where when you would twist in, it would lose volume, right? So we might consider using that skinning for that sort of object. But the center one that maintained its volume, that would be ideal for something like a human or a character. So generally with humans and characters, we're going to use dual quaternion. Okay, so that was the purpose of me showing you all three of these so you can understand how those work. So we're going to set that to dual quaternion because that's going to be what we use on our character. Now, the last thing I want to show you with this particular file is the concept of weight painting. So I'm just going to delete away everything else here, and we can take a look at the weight painting tools. I'll go ahead and select this object, and we'll go to our bind pose by going to skin, go to bind pose, then I'll just go to skin unbind to unbind the classic linear. Then I can shift click these together, and we can go to our skin, and we can just bind skin using the dual quaternion approach. Now, the idea behind weight painting is as we pose our object, we can actually come in here and paint the influences to affect how this looks. The way we do that is we select the geometry here, come to the skin menu, and we can select this option here called paint skin weights. Now, if you just select this by itself, it's not that useful, but you'll get a brush. And if you click on your surface, it will affect your geometry in a particular way. Now, how is it affecting that? Well, good question. It's affecting it through influence selection. So what's a better way to do this? The better way is to pull up the weight paint menu. You'll notice over here where our tool is, we have weight paint selected. If you double click that, it will pull up the tool settings for this menu, and you'll see it actually has its own little icon. We can then nest this somewhere. Usually I like to nest this where my outliner is or next to it, like so. And we can see the various joints in this chain. Now we can select through these, and this will determine what we're painting. So let's say I wanted to paint the middle joint. I could select the middle joint here, and now I could come in with my brush and I could paint on this. And what it's doing is it's showing in white the area of influence of this joint. The more opaque it is, the more influence it has. You can also select a joint by right-clicking on the joint in the viewport. This can be a challenge though, because if you right-click on the geometry, you'll notice that you get the component menu. So just be very careful and make sure you right-click onto the joint. You can then go to Select Influence, and that will toggle your influence selection to where you can come in here and paint it as if you are painting that influence selection. And you'll say how I can paint that so that it is now being affected one-to-one by that joint. Moving down into the menu here, there are some interesting things to check out. So the first thing to do is the joint selections. That's going to be where we can manually select joints, but they do have some different icons. For example, you have the ability to lock and unlock joints. And what that will do is it'll make it so that influence can't be adjusted. If you toggle this to be a golden little lock here, you'll see that is now locked, and whatever joint 3 is, which is the one we on, can't have influence added to it anymore. You'll notice it looks like there's influence being added. Sometimes that does actually happen. I'm not 100% sure why that didn't work, because I'm pretty sure we had joint 3 locked, but it shouldn't have. So I'm not 100% sure why that occurred the way it did. So very interesting, but we'll explore that later on. Now, other things we can do is we can switch between select and paint select. I don't really use those ever, so I just do the manual selections that I've shown you. We will do some selection, but I don't like to do it here. You can see that if we switch to the select mode, we can select these, but notice the joints get in the way. So there's other ways we can do that. Next is going to be our method of painting. You'll see it's currently set to replace, and that's probably why it worked with that being locked. When you set to replace, it replaces the existing value with the value you are painting in there. The one that I like to use is add. That adds to the existing value, and that tends to be a little bit better and more accurate, I find. So what that allows us to do is come in here, select our influence, and rather than replacing what was there, we're adding to it. And that can be useful and more predictable than the other methods. I don't use scale, so I won't really talk about what that does, because honestly, I don't really know. But I do use smooth on occasion, and smooth is a way you can average these. Now, smooth is very dangerous, though, without having lock set up. So this is where the locks really come in. When you use the smooth operation here, what it's going to do is it's going to average between all unlocked vertices, and it tries to do so based on locality. So, what I mean by that, it's going to try and average this value out to these existing areas as much as possible. But what I find with the smooth is it has this issue where it often likes to add influences into weird areas. So notice how we started to get these influences down here. That was from the smoothing up there. Those little faint areas, like where my mouse is hovering, that's because I smoothed up there and it took that value and it placed it down here. So if I wanted to prevent that, I could have locked this. Next is the brush profile. You can see different brush profiles here. Following that, we have our opacities and our values. If I switch back to add, you'll see we can change this here. And right now we have a value of 1, which means when I paint with this, we get 100% control. So if I paint that edge loop there, it's 100% controlled by this. If I paint this edge loop here, it's 100% controlled by that. We generally don't want that. We like to use lower opacities, and something like 0.03 or even 0.3 is very good to start with. If we go ahead and select this influence here now, you can see when I paint, it just nudges it in that direction now. So it allows us to gradually shape this rather than forcing it there. And I can come in and I can give this partial opacities so that it's blending between these points, and it's not, A or B, it's something in between. So we can get nice smooth shapes that way. Now, opacity and value are the same and different at the same time. Value is the maximum value that it can essentially be. So we're 0.3 adding up to 1. You could also set the value to something like 0. And you could paint in values of 0 in some instances, especially if you use something like replace. So this is where replace could be useful. You can't add 0 to get rid of areas, but you can replace things with 0. So you can see I could use that as a subtraction, and that's switching value and opacity. So you can take away and you can add using those. You also have this option here called flood, which if you select and click flood, it will flood it with that value. Now, the way this works is with selections though, because if we have a selection, it floods the selection. So for example, that flooded everything to the base. I could isolate this, right click and go to vertices, highlight everything upstream, double click back into my painting tool with those selected. I can then select the joint I want to flood to. So let's say this joint, and I can flood, and now that's going to be flooded there. And then I could repeat that process. Now, what's cool is this also works with smoothing. So let's say I wanted that to have 100 influence, but I wanted this one to smooth here. I could double click and we could come to smooth, and I could click flood on that, and it's going to flood smooth between there. I can select this one and it will flood smooth between here. And we can just kind of toggle back and forth between these until we get something we feel looks halfway decent. And you can see that right clicking doesn't always work there. It's kind of a challenge. All right, so that is going to be the flood. Now, after this, we don't really need to worry about most of these settings. You can switch this to using a color map gradient instead of black and white if you prefer. Down here, you can control things like these strokes. So this is going to be the radius size and the stamp spacing. If you want to control the brush size, all you have to do is hold down B. And when you hold down B, you can drag right or left to change the size. So that's going to be a way you can change your brush size. With stylus pressure, if you're using something like a stylus, like a Wacom, you can adjust stylus pressure there. Under display, this gives you various ways you can control the display as you paint. You can read through these. They're pretty straightforward. I don't worry about any of them. So I just use the defaults. Okay, so that is weight painting 101 there. That is the base rundown of skin binding, the base rundown of weight painting. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at this. We're going to implement these techniques in our character. But before we do that, I encourage you to set up a similar file to this. Just create something basic like a cylinder, throw some joints in there, go ahead and take a look at the different binds, go ahead and do the different painting methods, and just get used to the tools. So that way, when we get to the character, things go very smoothly. Now, I will give you a disclaimer. I don't really use the brush much when I do rigging anymore. I'm going to show you my very streamlined way to get things set up, and hopefully it will make this a fairly painless process. All right, so go ahead and play around with those tools, and then we'll go ahead and tackle the skinning of the character next. Be sure to like and subscribe so you can catch the next video in the series when it goes live.